Well, after weeks of hype, the Knicks draft came and went without a trade. Melo and Porzingis are still part of the team. And here to help us figure out what this means to the Knicks is Knicks writer for WFAN, John Schmeelk, joining us once again. John, boy, so many questions. Where do we begin? I think it begins with really the big headline, the fact that the Knicks were willing to deal, but they couldn't find a deal. What does this really mean for the future of the relationship between Porzingis and the Knicks?
Well, there are a couple things about this that I think are interesting. One, I personally don't mind Phil Jackson accepting phone calls. I think that's the responsible thing to do when the Knicks are in the situation they're in, being such, frankly, a bad franchise at this point. What I don't like about how Phil Jackson handled it is how public he was in saying, I'm willing to trade our future franchise cornerstone, because that's only going to widen the chasm between Jackson and Porzingis, which, frankly, is already fairly wide.
Well, it is wide, and you know, okay, a lot of people are putting the blame on Phil Jackson, but let's focus a little bit on Porzingis a little bit here, because he skipped some exit meetings, and he showed, at least at the end of the season, in a season that was lost, he showed, I guess, a lack of interest as we started to get down towards the end of the stretch of this year. What does it say about Porzingis' maturity? A guy who, look, you want him to be a leader, but leaders don't do those kind of things.
Porzingis made a mistake. He's a 21-year-old that got frustrated with the direction of the franchise, the president taking shots at his players, at his friends like Carmelo Anthony, and frankly, micromanaging the team and going over the head of the coach to talk to players. I understand that frustration. That being said, under no circumstance should you not go to an exit meeting. He made a mistake. He's 21. Phil Jackson's over 70 years old. At some point, he has to swallow his ego a little bit, forgive the kid, bring him in here, have a conversation, and make this go away. Derrick Rose skipped a game last year. Phil Jackson's willing to re-sign him, a much better player that's made only one mistake since he's been in the NBA. Skipping a non-mandatory, by the way, exit meeting should not be a deal breaker that forces you to trade a great player like him.
So there is a salve that can be put on this wound. It can be healed?
It can be, but is Phil Jackson willing to do what's necessary to do it? Kristaps Porzingis, through his representatives, has said, I want to be in New York long term. He wants to be here. I think he's willing to come in and say, you know what, I made a mistake, I should have went to the meeting. But at the same time, I think Phil Jackson has to have a legitimate conversation with him as to the direction of the franchise and just make him understand what direction this thing is going. So Porzingis believes the Knicks can be a winner because he wants to win, Steve, I think, but, you know, above all else.
Oh, I appreciate that passion. I mean, that's something that maybe we haven't seen with some other players, which brings me to Carmelo Anthony. Was there and is there still an open window for a possibility of a trade there?
There's a possibility. I don't see one happening. If I had to bet between the three possible results of this scenario, they trade him, they buy him out, or he plays out the year, I personally think Carmelo Anthony is going to be a member of the Knicks next year.
He's a top 10 player.
Not anymore.
He's not close to a top 10 player in the NBA anymore.
I don't believe he's viewed that way, no. I think he's regressed so much on defense, and he's lost enough athleticism going to the rim, where now he's more of a volume jump shooter than he is an explosive athlete that can score in a variety of ways. And with his contract, where he's making $25 million a year, he has a trade kicker where his salary goes even higher in the event the Knicks trade him. I think other teams have a hard time justifying paying a one-dimensional player. You know, he can rebound too. I shouldn't say one-dimensional. Like Anthony, that much money to fit him onto their roster with his defensive deficiencies.
So that's why the market for a guy like Carmelo Anthony, Carmelo specifically, why that market has gone soft for him?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of his issues on defense and how he hurts a team there with the amount of money he makes. It's tough to make trades work with the salary cap.
Okay, well, can they clearly move forward with a player that Phil Jackson just doesn't seem to want on this team anymore?
You know, it's a good question. I mean, they might have to. And remember, it's a no-trade clause, too. I think if all 30 teams were open for a potential trade for Carmelo Anthony, maybe they'd be able to get something done. We'd have a different conversation here. That no-trade clause basically limits the Knicks to 3 or 4 different teams to trade with, and there really isn't a good match of assets with teams like the Cavs or the Clippers or teams like that. The Knicks might not have a choice. I mean, it's been awkward with Melo for a couple years now. What's one more? He maybe opts out after his deal next year, hits free agency, or the Knicks could always just buy him out and move on without him. I think really that's the decision. When all is said and done, Steve, when they can't find a trade for him, and I don't think they will they buy him out, pay him for 2 years, or use that stretch provision and just bite the bullet on him, or are you going to punish Melo and make him play out his contract here on a losing team? Those are the two options.
right, so let's look to the future and what they did in the draft. And Ntilikina, a point guard, who apparently fits best in this triangle, but he's only averaging 5 points per game. He's obviously offensive challenge, but apparently he averaged more fouls than assists in France. What are we getting with this guy?
Well, Frank Ntilikina is interesting. You know, the way Europe works, young players don't get the opportunities generally that older players do. They make those guys wait. Even in Porzingis' last year playing in the Spanish League, he came off the bench. He averaged only 10 points a game, 4.5 rebounds or something like that. So in Europe, they make these guys earn their keep and earn their way onto the floor. He's a starter on a team that went to the French finals in a very strong league. The French league as a whole is probably stronger than the NCAA. It's a good league. He's a future point guard, but on his French team right now, he plays off the ball as a defensive specialist. So I think when he comes to the Knicks here, Steve, he'll be ready to help defensively. He shoots over 40% from three-point land, so he can shoot the ball a little bit. But it's his point guard skills, his playmaking, handling the ball, things like that I think are going to be a developmental process. But I think he can help the Knicks defensively and with the shooting right away.
What does it say that, you know, this guy, this is a lottery pick, okay? Lottery picks usually come in and are immediately key contributors to a squad. He's a future project. He's a little bit more like a diamond in the rough, if you will. How damaging could that be for the Knicks to not get anything from him this year?
Well, the thing about it, he has tools that the other two players they could have taken don't. He's 6'5" with a 7'1" or 7'3" wingspan, depending on the reports. Dennis Smith Jr. and Malik Monk have wingspans of 6'3" or 6'4". So he has tools that those two other guys don't. And I think Ntilikina has a better chance of developing into a two-way player that can play both offense and defense than either Monk or Smith. And you're right, the first 2 years, this draft pick might not look good because Smith and Monk are going to fill up the box score, and Ntilikina's not. But I think one thing that's really held the Knicks back, Steve, over the last 15 years, they haven't played defense since literally the 20th century, and Jeff Van Gundy was the head coach. Ntilikina was the best guard defender in this draft. That's why I don't have a problem with the pick.
Well, it seems like Phil Jackson has an appetite for those international players. Is it because Euro players are more defensive-minded?
I'm not sure they're more defensive-minded, but I think they haven't had their minds polluted, and I think this is me speaking Phil Jackson
by American
language.
Basketball? Is that what it is?
By the AAU circuit, and I really do think Phil Jackson thinks the AAU circuit ruins a lot of American players. They get them to play a certain way where they want the ball in their hands, they dominate the ball.
A lack of fundamentals?
Exactly. Lack of fundamentals. You don't share the ball as much, things of that nature, and I think he believes players in Europe are developed more in the way he wants players developed than they are here in the States these days.
Phil Jackson hasn't drafted. Now, Phil Jackson's been with the Knicks for, 4 drafts now, even though 2016 there were no draft picks. He hasn't drafted a freshman, sophomore, or junior. What does he not value? What does he value with the older guys here?
Well, you know, Ntilikina and Porzingis were two of the youngest guys in their draft class. So we go back to the European thing that we talked about already. And then Jaren Grant and Clay Anthony early were the two collegiate players the Knicks picked. And, of course, Willie Hernangomez, another foreign-born player. So I think he likes the fact that they have experience. They can come in. They can contribute right away. But remember, he's not allergic to first-year guys, because all those Porzingis trades was Phil Jackson trying to trade up and draft Josh Jackson out of Kansas, who is a one-and-done player. So there was a player with that profile that he did want in this draft.
So I think the real bottom line here is when you look at the Knicks and what we expect this Knicks roster to be this upcoming season, are they closer or further away from their ultimate goal?
I think they added one more good player in Frank Ntilikina. That's a young guy that can help down the road, so I think in that way they're closer. I also think in no uncertain terms are they viable for a playoff spot this year or probably even next year. But you know what, Steve? That's okay. You know, the Knicks have been trying to
When is that okay for any Knicks fan? They hate the idea of not being a playoff team.
The Knicks fans have dealt with bad basketball for 15 years. The Garden continues to sell out, and it's been the Knicks' insistence on trying to find quick, short-term fixes that solve things right away with free agent signees and trades that have gotten them into the situation they're in. Draft a bunch of young guys, let them develop together. Don't trade Kristaps Porzingis unless you can get a monster package back that so far no one has been willing to give, and you get a few more draft picks, and maybe in 3 years when LeBron James is maybe ready to retire, maybe the Knicks are ready to compete with a team like the Celtics or the Sixers and make some noise in the playoffs.
Tear it down to the rivets and see what you can build up from the ground up. We'll see if the Phil Jackson 10-year plan comes to fruition anytime soon.
Steve, it's working for the Yankees, right?
Yeah, right. Well, it happened a lot quicker for them as well.
Oh, that's true.
All right. Knicks writer John Schmeelk, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Steve. Happy to be here.
All right, stick around. We'll be right back.